It's been nearly 3 decades since the unsolved murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey, a case that captivated the nation. And even though her parents always denied any involvement in her death,
there are cases that the world never forgets. Cases that burrow so deep into the public consciousness that decades pass. Children grow into adults, and still the questions remain unanswered. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey is one of those cases. A 6-year-old girl, found dead in the basement of her own family's home the day after Christmas in 1996, became one of the most talked about, most debated, and most heartbreaking unsolved mysteries in American history. Her face, forever frozen in pageant photographs, became a symbol of innocence stolen. And for 28 long years, the world watched, wondered, and waited. Waited for answers, waited for justice, and perhaps most of all, waited to hear from the one person who had stayed completely silent through all of it, her older brother, Burke Ramsey. Burke was 9 years old when his little sister was taken from him. He was a child navigating a loss that no child should ever have to face, and yet instead of being given the space to grieve, he found himself pulled into one of the most intense media storms the country had ever seen. People pointed fingers. Suspicion filled the air, and Burke said nothing publicly for nearly 3 decades. Until now, when Burke Ramsey finally sat down for an interview with Dr. Phil after 28 years of public silence, the world leaned in. Here was a man who had carried an enormous weight since childhood, who had watched his family be torn apart by accusation and grief, who had seen his mother Patsy die of cancer in 2006 without ever learning who killed her daughter. And finally, he was ready to speak. His words were not the dramatic confession that tabloid culture had spent decades fantasizing about. They were something far more human, far more painful, and in many ways far more revealing. Burke described what it was like to be a 9-year-old boy in a house that had just been shattered. He remembered being in his room, hearing something downstairs, but not fully understanding what was happening. In his young mind, he told himself it might be something dangerous. And so he did what many children do in moments of fear. He stayed still and trusted that his parents would handle it. That decision, that very ordinary childhood response to fear, would later be twisted by media speculation into something sinister. He talked about standing at his sister's funeral, staring at that small casket, and noticing that something about her eyes looked different. He was 9. He didn't fully understand what death meant yet. It was only when his father broke down in tears while telling Burke that JonBenét had gone to heaven that the reality of what had happened began to settle into his young bones. That image, a grieving father trying to explain the incomprehensible to a confused child, is one of the most quietly devastating details Burke shared. It strips away all the conspiracy theories and media spectacle and leaves behind only raw, human grief. But Burke's silence over the years had never been interpreted charitably. Because he didn't speak, people filled in the gaps themselves. They analyzed his childhood police interview footage, noting that he smiled at certain points, and declared it suspicious. Burke addressed this directly, explaining that what people read as a smile was actually discomfort. Nervous reactions in children, particularly during police questioning about traumatic events, often look nothing like what adults expect grief to look like. Child psychology experts have long documented this phenomenon. Children under stress frequently display expressions that seem inappropriate to the situation because their emotional processing works differently than that of adults. But nuance rarely survives the media machine, and for years, Burke's nervous expressions were used to paint him as guilty of something. The accusations followed him everywhere. His father, John Ramsey, once recounted a trip to a grocery store when Burke, still a young boy, looked up and saw a newspaper headline that accused him of being involved in his sister's death. He broke down crying right there in the aisle. That image is worth sitting with for a moment. A child who had just lost his little sister, who was trying to make sense of an adult world of grief and investigation, confronted with his own name printed in accusation on a public headline. The cruelty of that moment is staggering, and yet it was simply Tuesday for the Ramsey family in those years. What the public often failed to consider was the enormous failure that had already occurred before any theories about the family even began circulating. The handling of the crime scene on the day JonBenét's body was discovered was, by most expert accounts, a catastrophic failure. In the hours after Patsy Ramsey called 911, The home was treated more like a gathering place than a sealed crime scene. People moved through it freely. Evidence was disturbed. Critical physical clues that might have told investigators exactly what happened were compromised or lost entirely. And then came the moment that investigators still discuss today. John Ramsey, guided by a detective who casually told him to have a look around, found his daughter's body in the basement himself. He picked her up and carried her upstairs, an act that, while completely understandable from a father's perspective, further damaged what little integrity the crime scene had left. From that moment, the investigation was crippled, and rather than acknowledge those early failures, local investigators instead turned their focus almost entirely on the family. The ransom note, written on paper from inside the house and demanding exactly $118,000, a figure that matched a bonus John Ramsey had recently received, became the centerpiece of suspicion. Who writes a ransom note and then leaves the victim in the basement? The question seemed to answer itself for many investigators, but others pointed out that the very oddness of the note, its unusual length, its strange details, might equally suggest someone trying to frame the family, or someone whose psychological profile was far outside the norm. Retired Detective Lou Smith, brought into the investigation because of his remarkable record of solving cold cases, became one of the few voices within law enforcement willing to challenge the tunnel vision that had taken hold. Smith reviewed the evidence carefully and came to a conclusion that directly contradicted the dominant theory. The evidence, in his assessment, pointed not to the Ramseys, but to an intruder. He documented what he believed were signs of entry into the home, physical evidence that had been overlooked or dismissed, and a general investigative path that had simply never been explored seriously. His colleagues in the Boulder Police Department did not receive this well. He was mocked, marginalized, and eventually left the official investigation after just a year, though he never stopped working the case on his own. Before he passed away in 2010, Lou Smith had assembled a list of potential suspects, individuals whose names had never been seriously pursued by official investigators. He passed that list to his daughter Cindy, who has continued his work quietly and determinedly. Cindy has been collecting DNA samples from every person on her father's list, hoping that one day, if the unidentified male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing is ever made available for advanced testing, they might find a match. And that unidentified DNA is really where the story becomes most urgent in the present day. In 2008, more than a decade after JonBenét's death, the district attorney announced that DNA from an unknown male had been found on the little girl's clothing. This discovery was significant enough that the DA issued a formal apology to the Ramsey family, acknowledging that the evidence did not support the accusations that had been leveled against them for years. John Ramsey received the apology with a complicated mixture of relief and hollowness. It was not justice. It was acknowledgement that a terrible wrong had been done to his family. But it did not bring his daughter back, and it did not tell him who had taken her. Then, in 2018, something happened that reignited John Ramsey's hope in a way nothing had in years. The Golden State Killer, a man who had evaded law enforcement for over 4 decades, was finally identified and arrested, not through traditional forensic methods, but through genetic genealogy. By analyzing DNA samples and comparing them to genealogical databases, investigators were able to build a family tree that eventually led them to a living suspect. The technique was precise, powerful, and capable of identifying individuals even when their DNA was not already in any law enforcement database. John Ramsey learned about this technology and immediately understood its implications for his daughter's case. The unidentified male DNA from JonBenét's clothing had sat in the Boulder Police Department's evidence room for years. Modern genetic genealogy techniques, of the kind used by experts like C.C. Moore, who had by that point helped solve over 200 cold cases, could potentially do something with that DNA that traditional forensic science never could. Not simply check it against existing databases, but actually trace it through family connections, build a profile, and potentially identify a suspect who had never appeared on anyone's radar. C.C. Moore has spoken about this kind of work with both passion and gravity. She describes genetic genealogy as assembling an enormous puzzle, analyzing 1 million points within a person's DNA rather than the few dozen markers that traditional forensic labs examine. This depth of analysis creates a fundamentally different kind of investigative tool, one capable of generating new leads where previously there were none. Her colleague Dr. Ellen Gradick has similarly explained that modern DNA analysis has transformed the field in ways that would have seemed impossible even 20 years ago. Where older methods depended entirely on finding a direct match in an existing database, today's methods can work outward from a sample, tracing biological relatives and constructing family connections until a suspect emerges. For John Ramsey, this represents the clearest path to justice he has seen in 28 years. He has pleaded with the Boulder Police Department to allow independent, trusted laboratories to test the remaining DNA evidence using these modern techniques. He has, by his own account, been met with resistance at every turn. The same investigators who initially focused on the family rather than an intruder are, he says, still protective of a narrative they built early and have never fully abandoned. Admitting that the DNA evidence could now identify an outside suspect would mean confronting decades of investigative failure, and John believes that institutional pride has become an obstacle to truth. Out of what can only be described as desperation born from love, John Ramsey took his appeal to the governor of Colorado, asking the state's highest elected official to intervene and compel the Boulder Police Department to release the DNA samples for independent testing. He has spoken publicly about the comments people left while signing a related petition, ordinary people from all over the country, expressing the same simple belief that a child was brutally murdered and every possible effort should be made to find who did it. That sentiment, repeated in thousands of voices, gave John a measure of comfort even as the official channels remained closed to him. Burke Ramsey, now a software engineer living quietly away from the public eye, has carried all of this with him too. His decision to speak after 28 years was not about revenge, and it was not about relitigating old accusations. It was, at its core, the act of a brother who wanted the world to understand that behind all the headlines and theories and media spectacle, there was a real family, a real little girl who laughed and loved her pageant dresses and had a big personality that filled whatever room she was in, a real 9-year-old boy who stayed in his bed one December night not out of guilt but out of fear, who cried at his father's tears, who grew up in the shadow of a mystery that never resolved. JonBenét Ramsey would be close to 35 years old today. Her case remains officially open. The Boulder police have confirmed that the investigation has never been closed. And somewhere, if John Ramsey and Lou Smith's daughter Cindy and the growing community of forensic genealogy experts are right, the person responsible for her death may still be alive. The technology to find answers exists. The DNA evidence exists. What remains to be seen is whether those in positions of authority will finally allow modern science to do what decades of conventional investigation could not: deliver justice to a little girl who has waited far too long for it, and to a family that has never stopped asking for it. Burke finally broke his silence. The world listened. Now the only question that matters is whether anyone with the power to act will do so.